Up next, we have the Who Will Tell Her Story panel. I'm going to introduce Joni James, who will moderate this discussion. Joni is the Chief Impact Officer of the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg, whose mission is to end differences in health due to social or structural disadvantages. Joni has been a journalist for 2 decades. She was a political reporter for the Tampa Bay Times and also a deputy editorial page director. She's also been the CEO of the St. Petersburg Downtown Partnership, a private business sector member group with a long tradition of managing public and private projects. The first panel, we hope that you'll stay. We welcome you to stay to hear the discussion. And if Joni's panelists can please come up to take their seats. Sorry, I see a lot of
You're fine.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So I want to thank you all for having us. I want to thank you for, it's always fun to have a substantive conversation with a group of women. That's always good. And I think you're going to feel like this conversation sort of feels like the other side of the coin from the panel that Susanna just led. Just as she noted the importance of women's artistic perspective being heard and seen and supported in our culture, so is the factual representation of history. If art is the interpretation of life and experience, history is, on the best day and with the best intention, the factual reflection and chronicling of that experience. So we all know that that doesn't really happen very often, right? And I think we can go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who are credited with creating the word history. From the beginning, this word was defined by man, gender specific. The old adage, history is written by the victors, applies here, right? If men were the dominant cultural force, they also wrote the language, and they put it in their own image. And in fact, Susanna and Catherine and others all sort of spoke to this, that what we're really talking about here is fairly radical as a construct, to think about rewriting history to include her story. It's the notion that history must include not just her story, but all history, otherwise it's nothing more than a one-sided tale. And it's to encourage all of us to become better advocates for her story. History isn't objective. It is collective, iterative enterprise, almost always dominated by the powerful, and only too often requires time to be told accurately and comprehensively. Today, our panel, we have 3 women who have seen that process firsthand. How history first gets told, how it gets refined, and over time, how it gets remembered. So with that, I'd like to introduce Layne DeGregory. Is a journalist. So as we talk about a rough draft of history is how newspapers were often talked about by the head, Mr. Graham of the Washington Post coined that phrase, I believe. Layne is a byline I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with in the Tampa Bay Times. She is a former colleague of mine and friend. She has long distinguished herself as a writer of those stories of those who are in the margins of society. I just want to bring to light, many of you I'm sure remember the story A Girl in the Window about Danny. That was Layne's work that also won her the Pulitzer Prize, and I can't remember which year. 2009. Next, I want us all to give a warm welcome to Michelle Alexander. She is new to Tampa Bay. She joined the Stevenson University College of Law as its first African-American dean, I believe, 2 months ago. Michelle has a very rich academic background that I'm sure we're going to hear. You're going to feel that as she talks today. She is a Haitian American who has spent an academic career understanding and challenging the status quo, forces that exclude and discriminate those who are not in the majority, those whose experience is too often overlooked by history. And then next, I'd like you to meet my friend and the founding director here of this beautiful museum, the James Museum, Bernice Choo. Bernice is an architect in training. Excuse me, by training. She's an architect by training. She joined us in the community about 2 years ago, is that right? And she has built a career working with an incredible list of institutions, and particularly sort of specializes, I believe, in helping museums make transitions of all kinds. Sadly, we are losing her. It just was announced a week ago, 10 days ago. She has a fabulous new job going to Charleston, South Carolina, to help the creation of the International AfricanAmerican Museum, which is going to be built on what was the largest slave trading center, slave market, excuse me, in America. So that is, we look forward to maybe hearing a little bit more about that. So thank you all for being here. How many of you guys good, that's what I wanted you to do. You know, it has been amazing watching this story command the national stage. And I have to say, from a personal perspective, I remember my brother, who is 8 years older than me and played college football, Division I, once telling me, no one will ever pay to see women professional athletes. So, you know, Layne, I want to kick off with this because Layne actually told me a little bit of an anecdote just this morning. Sort of, you know, if you've worked in newspapers or any media, you understand that first rough draft of history is very much a curated process, right? It's not just that the reporter decides which facts to put in the story, but then you have editors who decide where or when that story gets played and how the headline gets written. So Layne, so I'm going to sort of say the broad question, but then I want you to share the anecdote you shared about this. She is one of the most successful female journalists in the country. And lately we've seen a bit more consciousness arising, I think, in the country around telling stories not yet told. This is the New York Times series. If none of y'all have picked up on, I highly encourage you to go find it. They are basically sort of acknowledging we have been all white boys in how we pick obits. So they, for about a year now, have been going back and finding those names and people, lots of women, lots of people of color, lots of LGBT people, that they now realize are totally worthy of being in the nation's largest newspaper. So talk to me, Layne, a little bit. You've now been a journalist for a quarter century. 30 years. What's changed in getting these stories told? What hasn't changed? And how does it change?
When I came to the Tampa Bay Times in 2000, there were still women there who worked on the women's page. And even the notion of that, you know, I think I was 32 when I came, was so archaic to me. That what does that mean? The other pages aren't for women? You know, we have sewing columns, we have gardening columns, we have fashion columns, and that was the women's news. So just in the 20 years that I've been there, there's been a market shift. We have many more, especially young women in the newsroom now. It's about half and half, whereas it used to be a whole lot more skewed toward the men. In management, our senior management team is about 60-40, which is a lot better than it used to be. But still, the decisions that are being made by old white men. And my editor now is a Hispanic woman, and she said she had to sit in on this discussion. She does the Sunday front page. She's in charge of the content of that, but it's another 9 guys that jump in with her to figure this out. She said the sports page was very excited to put the women's soccer win on the front of the sports page. She went, no, the front page. She said, why? This is what everybody's talking about, right? In the whole country. So she fought, herself to make sure that they gave the women a spot on the A1 that day instead of relegating them to the sports page, which also never has women on it, right? And I think there's one female assistant editor on the sports page, but everybody else is male on the sports page too. So she was very much like, yay, victory to get the women's soccer on the front page, I think, we recently started a study. Actually, a couple young women in the newsroom started a study because they were appalled by the inequity. And so I asked the editor yesterday if I could share some of our findings. And I've got some national numbers as well. But just at the Times, 59% of our readers are women, 59%. And yet 80% of the people quoted on our front page are white men. So we've started putting pictures up of the front page, like across the back of the newsroom wall, so you can actually see the representation in the photographs. And I mean, part of that is because who's in power, right? We quote the governor, we quote the senators, we quote the head of the school board, almost all men. So there's a natural skew toward people of power. But I think it's really reflective if you start counting like that and say 80% of who we quote, and that's on every story, not just the political stories, you know. So we need to do better about that.
And I think you would even find, if you dissected that further, when women are quoted, it's probably around certain topics. Right? Education.
Absolutely.
Things that, you know, frankly, the feminine topics, right? That you think the mother topics, right? Is often where it
And I'm
shows
also not sure how it's quoted in terms of, like, my first name is Layne, and a lot of people think I'm a man. So if you're reading my stories, almost all my mail gets addressed to Mr. DeGregory, which, whatever. But I don't know how we're counting that. You know, if somebody's name is Lee up here, too, you know, how do you count that? So I'm not sure. It might be even worse than we think.
Yeah, because not many men have women's names,
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I got some other numbers just in terms of media. If you guys are interested, The New Yorker, my favorite magazine, only 39% of the stories are by women in The New Yorker, which seems like a very progressive magazine to me. The New York Review of Books, 32% of women authors in there. American Society of Newspaper Editors, overall across the country, 40% are women, even though 60% of our readers are women. You know, so we have a long way to go. And I was talking to Joni earlier. She was an editorial writer for us. We have no women and no people of color on our editorial board now. So there's all these young women writing stories. There's all these young women pushing the agenda of what news should we cover, but they're not setting the voice and the opinion of the paper. So we miss you, Joni.
And I think at the when I was the deputy editor, I think at the largest we were was about 8 people, and there were 2 women. And we were all white, right? We were all white. Yeah. So, you know, we have seen, so we talked about this a little bit. We've also seen, you know, there is starting to sort of be this narrative in general about history, about how, you know, so the Donna Strickland, when she won the Nobel Prize, media took the opportunity to say, and here are 5 other women who should have, right? So that's progress to a certain extent, right? So it's progress to a certain extent, but not, you know, we really would like not to have to even make that distinction, right? Just like that you're not the first, right? You're just the next Dean. Hidden Figures, of course, is a story that really, I think, has done that, and plus the beautiful movie that they made, has really done a lot to raise this idea that history isn't exactly what you think it is, right? It is also a curated process. And then I wanted to put Michelle Obama's book up. How many people here have read it? Right. So I was so impressed with this book in the ways that she showed how the system, so history's a system, right? History really is a system, and our culture is really full of systems. And what Michelle Obama did so well in this book is really tell the history of the United States of the 20th century through the eyes of an African-American woman, right? Which is something that I had never read before. I could piece together a bit just because of my own attempts to try to figure this stuff out, but never had I seen it so sort of beautifully articulated contemporaneously to where we are, right? That I learned a lot about my childhood by understanding what her childhood was like, right? I understood some of the people that I grew up with in public school in a way that I was not aware of. There's another great book I would say about that called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is the book about the dysphoria in the 20th century of African Americans after Reconstruction to other parts of the country. And understanding that those are the stories of my school-age friends' grandparents, right? In ways that I never had any idea what their family histories were. So talk about that, and then Layne, I also want we talked about this, right? A lot of our news these days that focuses around women is around the issue of discrimination and sexual harassment and sexual abuse. It took all, I can't remember who made we were talking about the Senate confirmation issue a little bit earlier. It took all these women saying similar things for this man to be called to account. That's also, even with progress, what we're facing. Is that, I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you think sexual harassment and sex abuse and sort of gender discrimination is treated differently now in newsrooms, do you think, since Me Too and other things?
I think they can't ignore it anymore, right? And I think the way that it's being told is different, too, because before, you know, if someone made an accusation against someone, we would never publish that in the paper just because it's an accusation, unless you can figure it out and prove it and get the other side and really document it. That's got to be something official. But when you've got, how many women is that?
I'm sure that's not all of them.
18 women who are all telling you the same story. Okay, we have to listen, you know. And I think it's unfortunate that it takes that many, but I also think that people are being taken a lot more seriously than they used to be about an accusation. And the idea of like, oh, well, what was she wearing? She must have been inviting that to come, has sort of been hushed a bit. It's not looking at the accuser as the person who initiated the problem. That's like they're putting the fault on the woman. You know, I think that's changed, happily.
So just, Layne touched on this a little bit in just newspapers, but also we found this slide of, so 63% of all media is written by men. Think about that: internet, bylines, print, television, wire services, 63%.
And women make 87% of what men do across newsrooms. Still.
So gender pay gap, right? Which also back to the soccer, how right, we weren't just celebrating what fabulous athletes they were. We also had to, now they have leverage to maybe talk about gender pay gap, right? Now, I think that's what we have to do, but man, it's annoying. So I want to turn to academia because so in the next step of history, right, first you've got journalists who are sort of doing the contemporaneous record. Next you have academia, is where a lot of the history gets baked fully. But that is also a culture in and of itself, one that comes very much out of a patriarchal model. We still have only one woman to every 2 men on governing boards in higher education. 30% of presidents across all institutes of higher learning. Want to commend Athena Society for having 2 of them as their members. But want to talk to, what's going on, because, the old argument used to be there's no pipeline. We can't find enough candidates. You'll hear that across every sector, right? Every industry will say, not enough women are qualified, not enough women for the job. We've been training a lot of women in academia for a long time. So I want to talk to Michelle a little bit about what do you think the barriers here are to why we aren't seeing higher ed institutions more led by women, such as yourself, and what works to get them in those positions, and what still are we not aware of?
Well, thank you, y'all, for this discussion. I'm struck by the fact that we opened with the women's soccer team, and because they touch on these issues from multi-layered. I work on dismantling gender inequity, but of course, because I'm a legal scholar, I tie in the law. But I work on it from a non-binary and non-normative perspective. So the soccer team, to me, is emblematic of all of the hurdles that we face in getting to these issues. So one is we don't deconstruct facts in real time in this society. So we've assumed a lot of falsities about what it is to be a person in this world. So the facts about being a person are not faced. Instead, we operate on myths. So you posted that we as academic deconstruct history, but my job is to deconstruct facts in real time and help understand who we are. So if you take the women's soccer team and the whole struggle we have with gender equity and Title IX. So Title IX prevents gender discrimination in education. So that ties into athletics. The pipeline for the women's soccer team is Title IX. Without Title IX, we don't have women in the Olympics. We don't have women in this beautiful
The arena,
bodies.
right.
We don't have these beautiful bodies. But Title IX is struggling with understanding what bodies are and what people are. So my work centers on breaking down the assumption that there is any one way to be, and that even being a woman, there's no predictable way to be. So if we remove, two things that I would like everybody to think about, a point of discussion regarding these hurdles. If we remove the assumption about performance, even body-wise for women, so removing assumptions about gender binary, then we think about the normative expectations about interviews. Even when a woman walks into the room, when we interview women, all of the things that we know they saddle by, but we don't interrogate how we are perpetrating that ourselves. And then assumptions about heteronormativity that saddle women in the workplace. We are an heteronormative society. So that means that assumptions about who's going to take care of children, the two-headed households, which is counter to facts, right? 40% of the households are led by single women. However, that prevents them from getting to interviews, from getting to be able to get to the CEO, et cetera. So when we think about what the hurdles are to women getting on governing boards, what role is the personal in all this? What role do we all play when we are evaluating who should take the lead on our organizations? I think if we ask ourselves, as much as we are aware about the systematic, right, all of those data, but what are the facts regarding our own interpretation about who's worthy? So those are the hurdles I'm really interested in having this discussion about, because without the discomfort of talking about, well, if someone has kids, I might not hire them to be in charge of a large organization because I'll be afraid of their time management. What kind of expectations would we put on that person to surmount this obstacle about what we would expect of them? So Audre Lorde, right, often is quoted as saying the tools of the master's house will never be apt to dismantle the master's house, right? If we want to destroy something that is operatively, systematically as destructive, we'll never be able to use those same tools. And I would posit that we've been using the same tools. We use the same evaluation system. But we do it so personally, in hiding. And then when we kind of attempt to talk about it, it's very uncomfortable. So the last word I'll say on this is I welcome kind of those points of discomfort. Can we make statements about the personal that maybe are just so uncouth that it triggers some discussion?
So I think I've got a quote from the opening of, she has a book called Sexploitation where she talks about some of this. I did not get very far into it, but I encourage you guys to look it up because it is definitely talks about breaking down those frameworks that we have about how we view the world and the social constructs of who is qualified for roles, who is going to be best suited for roles. I pulled this quote out in part because I think this did a really nice job in an anecdote talking about how these constructs and how history pigeonholes and defines people's roles and defines their responses. For example, while average citizens may think that the practice of law has little impact on their lives, the contours of legal decisions, the policies they generate, and the identity and background of the judges very much affect public as well as private laws. In addition, sexist publications that posit women as inferior to men under the guise of difference, to Michelle's point, whether they get their veneer of respectability from science or tradition, affect judges as they do the rest of society. An essential part of reversing the ugly business of gender inequity is to show the connection between bias outside of the courtroom and bias in the courtroom. So it's all connected, right? I think a lot about how you clearly, you talk a lot on your website about your mother, was quite a fighter. I'm curious how you came to appreciate how these societal constructs affect the personal, right, and affect the limitations that we may put on ourselves.
That's a good question. So the title of this panel is Who Tells the Story? And what I tell my students very vividly now for 15 years is you tell the story, we tell the story, I tell the story. So what I've learned and why I'm pretty categorical about this, you'll learn, because I'm impatient. I think we learn about, we tend to be in the position of the traditional shock and awe that gambling is happening in this establishment when it comes to gender inequity. We do it after the fact. The pictures that you just show about, oh yeah, the women were due their Nobel Prize and they'd been out. So that's the story. That's always the story. We're always catching up and shocked that their sexism was happening, right? So in 2019, and you know, the 21st, this is the 21st century. This is a one life we're living. We have no idea whether or not we're going to regenerate in some other form when we die. So this is all we have, right? We happen to be living in an era with the most opportunities, the best understanding of what life might be, with all the wonders and the questioning of where we come from, what are we destined for. But we actually have opportunities no one has lived through. The opportunity that we might all one day have access to space, etc. Yet, we're not able to solve the basic thing of human relationship. We accept it in our private life as a de facto status quo, and then import that on others when it comes to building institutions. So that's the biggest, most simplest way that I can frame this to tell you the source of my impatience. So all that to say, right, that, of course, like many of you, I have the story of growing up, watching inequity, being a young woman, being told young people, you know, what girls don't do this, et cetera, et cetera. And I've always been some form of impatient, and I'm lucky to have a mother who woke up at 4 a.m. all her life and then made the journey transatlantic without, right, giving up everything, as all immigrants' family have done. But she was a single mother and had nothing when she came here, because when you're an immigrant from a South categorizing country, you don't come with anything unless somehow the fates had it that you had some other life. But that wasn't us. We had your usual immigrant story, and she made me into who I am. What does that mean? She gave me the model to fight and be scrappy and try to tell my story and tell it. And I'm telling you that this is so important. That's what I tell the kids about. Everyone thinks they know your story. Everyone will tell you who you are. And they do it all the time from the minute you're a child. And I think that's for any non-conforming person. That's why I say heteronormativity is sexism. Gender binary is sexism, because they are preventing us from being a full person. So when we're talking about gender equity, we'll never win by using these assumptions and thinking we're doing equity in progress. We are here living this human experience, and we happen to be at a time that we think we have the most opportunities, and we're trying to get it for the next generation, but yet we're limiting ourselves by not being able to imagine things outside of the construct they told us. And hopefully, I hope that we can do better than that.
Thank you very much. I want to, stories, right? Your personal story is yours, and having the confidence of that story, right? That it doesn't need to fit into this construct. Let's redefine the constructs. So I want to bring Bernice into our conversation a little bit. I want to sort of share, so Bernice has spent her career in museums, which, the folly of this conversation to a certain extent is about how history is sort of personified and displayed in museums, right? That is sort of how the mass consumption in the most, frankly, academic way it is shared in the country. But I wanted to make the point, too, about even as we see some progress at different points, we can't ever stop. So back in 1921, about 6 months after the 19th Amendment was passed, women got together and got this beautiful monument made of the suffragettes, and they had a big ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, one day later, the white guys in Congress got it mothballed, they scraped off the plaque, and they put it in the basement. And it sat there for 75 years. I'm actually kind of impressed they didn't get rid of it, right? I mean, it must have been just too heavy, right? The three of them have to share a single statue, exactly. Right, and so, this is now 98 years ago. So finally, in 97, a group of women led by a congresswoman whose name's escaping me brought it back up to the rotunda, basically raised the money, because it cost something like $75 just to take it out of the basement. It was so heavy. They had to do a survey to make sure the rotunda could handle the weight. Allegedly, they had to do that. But they did that. They jumped through all the hoops, and in 97, they put it back in its back where it belongs, or maybe we can, whatever. But that also was the start of the National Women's History Museum, which is now, best I can tell, is largely an online endeavor that does have some exhibits that travel. And I guess I wanted to bring Bernice into this about what in your career how have you seen the arc? We've talked a little bit about this in terms of art museums, but how do we see this also, the arc, just in including women's narratives and others' narratives?
Well, I'm not on the curatorial side of it, and my career didn't start in museums. So I wasn't aware of the culture of museums and who was actually running museums. So I started building things for brokers on Wall Street. So I was a very young woman in a field where there were no women, maybe one other woman, dealing with all these men. And I think that my advantage was people were just so surprised to see someone that was different than them that they just went along with the flow. But I wanted to talk about what Michelle was saying about how impatient we get, because I think that women that grew up in the 60s and 70s, our contemporaries, really set a path for younger women or kids in the next generation. But even when I was raising my boys, after all of these insights that we had about how to empower women, how to be your own voice, I still heard mothers on the playground, if there was unacceptable behavior, oh, it's okay, they're just boys. Or, well, I have a son and a daughter, but, the girls are like this, and really, to me, it's birth order, right? It may not be gender. I was probably lucky because I was brought up with girls, because if my mother had a son, the conversations in our house would have been very different, and we wouldn't have been as empowered to just be individuals. So I kind of grew up oblivious as to the male-female thing. But even now in our museum, we have zero tolerance for any unacceptable behavior, sexual comments, racist comments among our staff, because we have a lot of people that are front-facing. They're the visitor services people that you'll see on your tour. And yet, and we always tell them, we tell them in morning meetings, we say it's the culture. If somebody upsets you because something that's directed to you, you have to tell us right away, and we will act on it. And we do. Immediate investigation, expulsion, whatever. And I still see young women saying, well, I'm working on that. Like, why didn't you speak up? It's been 2 weeks, it's been 2 months, it's been half a year. And why aren't you speaking up? Why aren't you telling us? Well, I'm working on that. And I actually heard a young white man say the same thing because he felt he was being harassed by an older woman. And we said, well, he said, I just want to tell you about it, but, I'm working on speaking up. Why don't you say to the person that's talking to you disrespectfully, you need to stop that? And I still see young people that don't do it. So I don't know if it's nurture or if we're not getting the right message across, but women that still say, well, I didn't think I should say that. And I thought that should have gone away 30 years ago.
Except I think the Harry Weinstein story is a perfect example of women, in modern media. It's still the case of women speak up. It's the Senate confirmation hearing. It's women speak up and they are discounted and not believed. And so now they have, I think that is the culture.
It's very important because it goes back to the training, right? How we train and how are we training our children. And I do think that whether or not you're a parent directly or parenting in some way, you see it. And then the tragedy is that in 2019, we are raising appearing women and appearing young men in that same traditional way. And because we're not deliberate about it, we can. And I've seen efforts. I think we are at a better time today, so I'm not all doom and gloom. We are at a better time. I think young parents are trying to do a better job. But Bernice is absolutely right, that if you go to the playground and you're not deliberate or even have a conversation that's often uncomfortable, then you have young people being trained to be to take too long to speak up.
Right.
And boys to expect a certain behavior from each other and from others. And that is the crux of the problem. Once our brain are trained to do something, neuroscience tells us, it's very hard to undo. And we've been trained to do this for millennia. And the question is, how do we untrain ourselves?
Absolutely. I think
the original question.
But I think, so Bernice, why don't we talk a little bit about where you're headed in terms of this International African-American Museum. Talk a little bit about, you told us when we met a little earlier, the story of its origin, and I think is actually an example in a way of how those of us who have power and have entree can be an advocate for changing this narrative. To a little bit about the mayor of Charleston.
Oh, well, so the International African-American Museum was seeded 20 years ago by Mayor Joe Riley. He's been mayor for 40 years in Charleston. Yeah, so he just recently
no term
handed
limits.
over the reins. So I had lunch with him, and it was fascinating how the museum started, because there are things that I didn't realize about the South. He's a white Irish Catholic man, born and raised in Charleston. So he has a particular affinity for but he had a friend who wrote a book whose family had owned a number of plantations. And he decided to start researching what did that mean, because they didn't talk about slavery, and I didn't realize this in Charleston. And he found out all the horrors of the history of how people, like, it's different if you were coming to America on Ellis Island because you were coming from freedom. When you came into Gadsden's Wharf, you were coming into slavery. And two different very voyages for different people of different colors. So he didn't know about this and I said, so when did you read the book and when did this come about? He said, when I was in my 50s. He said, because people in the South don't talk about slavery. And even when he was pushing for this museum, people were saying to him, well, and white people were saying, well, Joe, why do you want to bring this up now? We treated them good. because at that time they thought of slaves as property, and you have to treat your property well, in order to take care of it. So people just didn't talk about it, and he said it was because I was shocked when I didn't realize he didn't know about the horrors of slavery. Because he said they don't talk about it in the South, because then right after Reconstruction, it went to Jim Crow, which was even worse than slavery. He said slave owners didn't, inadvertently hang their slaves because they were their property, but they were hanging, and Jim Crow was just, so the South has to deal with that. But he pushed for this museum, a white man, for this museum that to me is going to be, it's not just going to be a visitor's experience, but the visitors there will be participants, because it's not just a memorial for the slaves, but it's also about perseverance and the accomplishments of all the descendants, because 49% of slaves that arrived in this country arrived at Gadsden's Wharf. And that's where the site will be, right there on the water. And you'll be able to see what slaves saw or what people looked out after they landed. So it's just going to be an incredibly powerful project.
I think Brian Stevenson, if you're not familiar with his work, he wrote the book Just Mercy. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Institute, I think. He has a quote about Southern history, which as a Southerner I really appreciate. He says, "The North won the war, but the South won the narrative." And I think, as we talk about everything I grew up learning in the South, and actually now learning the rest of the story, that's what we're really talking about today, is that checking yourself constantly about, why do I think that? Why do I believe that's true? And sort of understanding the origin of that construct. I don't know how we're doing on time. 5 minutes. I wanted to just make this wonderful, so I don't know if y'all have heard this news. Long time coming. I happen to know there were several people in Tallahassee of both parties working for, I think, close to 10 years to make this happen. And I think just recently in the news it had that Governor DeSantis had sent the letter to make it formal. Finally, yes. Why it didn't happen? Rick Scott would not send it, according to Congresswoman Castor here. Yeah. So you do have to stop and pause for your triumphs, right? Because otherwise the work seems way too hard, right? You have to pause and triumph. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. And sort of back to that point of how we are all products of history and how we internalize them unless we are gifted, like Michelle, very early on to figure out how you're being conformed to, right, or how you're expected to, right?
Well, we can just think about it. I think it's not all lost. If we just ask ourselves and slow down a little bit and ask, how am I seeing this? Could I be influenced by some teaching? I think we get a long way. This is not just, we're not born being this way, and we don't have to end up that remaining biased. We all got some form of bias from being in this society, but I really think we go a long way when we say, am I doing this because I was taught to do it? Is there another way?
One last thought. I've always appreciated James Baldwin's thoughts about history, and I'd like to just close with a longer quote than this one. But for history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because thereafter one enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins to attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history. So I think this entire panel would encourage you to go out and wage battle against the tyrannical power of history. Thank you.